So I'm Amaury Séchet. I assume like most of you know me, so I'm not gonna go into too much detail here. Today I'm gonna talk about something that is a bit different from what I've been discussed before, and I'm gonna talk about some solution. I know like many people ask me about what kind of solution I have in mind, but before I want to talk about solution, and probably even more importantly than solution, I want to maybe reframe the problem I'm trying to solve a bit. And the main reason is as follows. I think the problem we have with zeroconf and zeroconf security in general and double spend and all of that are a whole class of problems that derive from the same root cause, right? And when we try to solve those symptoms rather than the root cause, we end up playing whack-a-mole a bit. So even though we can come up with better trade-off, we can like never quite nail it. And I can take example of a solution that have been proposed earlier during this conference. For instance, if we go to super standard transaction, then we have a set of transactions for which zeroconf works better, but then we have the set of transactions that is non-standard for which it's actually worse. So we are making a trade-off. Maybe it's a trade-off worth doing, but we are essentially making it better by making it worse somewhere else, right? And as long as you don't attack the root cause is just gonna show its head somewhere with some trade-off. So I would like to talk about the root cause a bit and see what we can do to improve things at that level. So what if I told you that zeroconf fast block relay, so spreading block very quickly on the network, which is also very important for scaling, which is another aspect of BCH we have not discussed much at this conference, but I think we all agree that it's very important. Free market fee determination, but other policies. So for instance, what is the minimum relay fee? Right now we have a bit of a problem determining that in a free market manner, right? Because when people don't agree with each other, then it degrades the security of zeroconf, so we can see a bit of a link there. And also, one thing that is fairly similar to zeroconf, but we've talked about zeroconf a lot in the frame of double spend, right? We have two transactions and one of them is going to confirm, but maybe I have just one transaction and maybe it's going to confirm and maybe it's going to not confirm. And anyone that have been using BTC, say in December last year, have a very good idea of what I'm talking about. You make a transaction and you have no freaking idea if it's gonna go through or not, and the only way you're gonna know is to wait several hours, even sometimes maybe days, which is an absolutely terrible user experience. So if you send a transaction and for some reason the network rejects it because it doesn't pay enough fee, because it doesn't respect whatever policy people choose to respect, then you need to be able to know it also very quickly and not have this zombie transaction roaming around for forever until everybody gives up on it. And I will argue that all those different problems have actually the same root cause. And this is what I want to talk about. So even though I'm going to discuss a bit of solution, if you need to remember something from what I'm going to say today is that root cause, because then there are different solutions we can explore, but it informs us on what those solutions may be. So Bitcoin as its root is DAG. It's a DAG of transaction. So what is a DAG? It's a type of graph. So a graph is computer science data structure. I think most people here are well versed in computer science, or at least in basics of graph theory. But it's a type of graph where you have different elements, in our case the transaction, and they are linked to each other because they spend money from each other. And this is a DAG that has some specific property. It's directed, meaning that the connection are not bidirectional, right? So if we are looking at a map, you can have a road between 2 points on the map, and either the road you can go in both directions, or it's a one-way street. So in our case, in our graph, we have only one-way streets. It's acyclic, which means it doesn't have cycles. You cannot go around in the graph. And this is actually not something that we verify or not something that we try to ensure in the graph. This is by construction, because each node in the graph, so that would be a node in graph theory lingo, in Bitcoin lingo, that would be a transaction. So each transaction contains the hash of the parent transaction. And because of the property of a cryptographic hash, we know that the parent transaction must have been created before the child transaction, or I wouldn't be able to compute the hash. And so it's impossible to have transaction A created before transaction B, and then transaction B created before transaction A. We have like a temporal impossibility here, which means that by design, it's impossible to have cycles in that graph. And this is very important because those kind of graphs have some special property that we can use. All right, so now we are in a distributed system. And even though if we were all omniscient, we could know all the transactions that exist and when they have been created and all of that. But in a practical sense, that is not possible. And this is one of the constraints you have to work with when you work on a distributed system. That means that the only thing you know is when someone else told you that some event happened. So for instance, someone forwarded you a transaction. Hey, there is this new transaction. So you have no way to know when that transaction was actually created. You just have a way to know when someone forwarded it to you. And you can know when you send the information to someone else, right? But you cannot never be sure that they actually received it, or that they processed it correctly, or that they accepted the transaction or dished it. Your scope, the scope of information that you have is actually quite limited and inherently very subjective, right? Because those information, when I witness some transaction and when I forwarded some transaction to someone else, is going to be completely different for every single node on the network. And so that means that each node have a DAG in its mempool of transactions that are being made on the network, but none of the nodes actually have the same DAG in there. They are all constricting it, so hopefully they are going in the same direction eventually, but at any point in time, they have a different view of what the state of the universe is. So then what happened, because of that state of affair, what happened is that we have this mining process and you produce block on a regular basis. And when someone finds a block, it's gonna take whatever subset of the DAG is aware of at that time, and consider valid and consider worthy of confirmation, put that in a block, find a block, and then forward the block to everybody else, and everybody else is going to try to reconciliate whatever they knew of the world locally with whatever is in the block, and potentially like reconsider whatever their view of the world is, right? So there is all kind of stuff they can disagree with what was in the block. Maybe there are some transactions in the block that don't fit the policy that this specific node would have accepted, but no, they change their mind and consider it valid because it's in the block. Maybe there is a double span, and the one in the block is not the one that the node considered as the true original one. So in that case, the node is gonna change his mind on which one is the real and which one is the double span. There is no objective way to say that, but know that there is a block. Everybody agrees with what is in the block, right? And so this happened, and the node continued to extend its DAG as people do more transaction, and the whole process repeats again and again and again. So we are in a situation that I think is very similar to what people that do physics call entropy, where the nodes are in the state, and the state evolves constantly, and the state between different nodes grows and grows and grows apart, right? And then when we find a block, it acts as a way to reduce entropy in the system, and then entropy starts growing again, right? So what we can see is that node, because this is a distributed system, nodes do not really agree on what the real or global state of the world is. That means, okay, I've been over that a bit already during the previous slide, but that means that some have seen a transaction, maybe some others have not seen it yet because it has not been forwarded to them. Some may have accepted the transaction, others may not have accepted it because maybe others consider that the fee is too low or whatever reason, like they do whatever they want. They may disagree in what order the transaction happened, because this transaction have been forwarded to them in a different order than some other node. And they will disagree on double spend, meaning if there are two transactions that spend the same money, some node will consider one to be the correct one, and some other node may consider the other one to be the correct one, and there is no there is no objective truth that you can know to actually know which one is the real one. That's a question that don't really make sense from the perspective of the node. And then a block is found, and then we converge. We essentially like shrink that entropy. We go back to a low entropy level. But this is quite slow, right? Because we find a block every 10 minutes. So in a graphical way, it's look like this. So let's imagine that this whole slide is a space, but not like a physical space. It's the space of the different states that the node can be in, right? So right now, a block has just been found. So all the nodes are very close in the space of state to where the block is, right? They may have a few extra transactions that they may consider valid. They may not agree on those, but for the most part, they agree on whatever is in the block. And as time goes on, they grow further apart, right? They accept information from the network, and they don't really try to agree between themselves about what is going on. And so they grow apart in the state space. And then eventually some new block is found by one of the nodes. And that node is going to propagate it to the other nodes, and the other nodes are going to try to reconcile their local state with whatever is in the block. And so they get there, and then we start the process again, because as we see, there is a new block, but we find ourselves in a situation similar to what we had before. And so we have a few problems with that. And this is where we reach to, I think, the core of the issue, is that node make no attempt whatsoever to reconcile state before a block is found. Right? They just pick up whatever is going on, make their local stuff, and grow apart. And then once every 10 minutes, they're going to try to reconcile their state. And so what happened is that the distance between a node and a new block that is found on the network in that state space can be potentially very high, right? Especially if there is a double spend that has been done early on, they may be on a completely different subgraph of transaction. So that's a challenge for fast block relay, right? Because the amount of state you have to reconciliate between what the node already processed and knows about locally and the state it needs to put itself in is big. Like the further apart those twos are, the more work there is to do for the node to actually accept that new block. So that's one of the one core issue I was talking about earlier, fast block relay. Right? Another one is that transactions are essentially in quantum state before a block is found, because depending on who is looking at the system, they're going to see different things, right? So it's not quantum in a literal manner, right? But it's very similar to what happened in quantum mechanics, where the system is going to be like quite in an undefined state unless you look at it, and looking at it in that metaphor would be finding a block. And so that means that user can never really know if a transaction has been rejected by the network or not. They just have to wait like forever until they give up. Because maybe that transaction may be accepted in the next block or not, and you don't know until the block is found, and then you repeat. And if there is a double spend going on, they don't know which one of the double spend is going to be accepted until there is a block that is found. And finally, that also means that policy, such as minimum fee, but essentially any kind of policy the node wants to apply on whatever it is doing, needs to be either central planned. So we say, maybe in that group, we decide, okay, the minimum fee needs to be X. And then we go to all the miner and businesses and say, okay, the minimum fee is X. And everybody uses the same minimum fee, and so there is no divergence going on there. But I would argue that central planning of economic matter usually doesn't work great on the long term. So that's not a very good, that's not a very good situation. But the alternative is probably even worse. At least I would argue that it's even worse, is that essentially we have no zero conf anymore. Because if everybody starts using different policies, then there is a complete fracture in the state of the block, because some are going to accept one transaction, some are not going to accept. So they're going to grow apart in that state space even faster than they do now. Which means we have a bit of a dichotomy between two pretty bad choices here. So,
Amaury,
yes?
at some point, can you go back to the previous slide? From the top, you say that nodes make no attempts to reconciliate state. You even said whatsoever. That's false. They send all the transactions to each other. They send reject messages when transactions are not acceptable. How can you say they're not reconciliating their state? That's exactly what they do on a continuous basis. The distance is potentially large. Is
not really. They don't try
when
to
it
reconciliate.
fails.
They don't try to. They announce what their state is to other nodes, but they make no effort whatsoever to try to all together come toward the same state.
They do, because they send their state to others, so they can, so the other nodes can see the same data that the first one saw, and they also send reject messages. There is a reject message in the
But when you forward a transaction and the other node reject because there is a low fee, locally the node does nothing about that message.
And that's another point you point out. There is no way, you said, to find out if something is rejected by the network. Yes, there is. You can listen to other nodes. You can listen to various nodes to see what their state is.
Yeah, but they're all going to give you a different answer.
And what does the network mean in your world? Because if there's lots of different nodes and some of them disagree with each other, that can happen, but only because of exceptional conditions. Like, for instance, a double spend. So different nodes have different ideas, which means that there is also a very, very small set of transactions that would cause a disagreement. So your point that it's
really, like today there are different miners that
interesting.
accept different fee levels, right? So if you send a transaction that have a fee that is in the right range, some people are going to accept it, some people are not going to accept it. Like, it's very easy right now to have nodes disagree with each other. And those different nodes, they make no attempt to...
It's also very easy to make them not disagree with each other. I think the vast majority of transactions get mined without any disagreements between nodes. We're probably talking about the 5 nines here.
May I suggest that we take this discussion afterwards and let Amaury finish?
Well, it seems to be his entire basis of the presentation.
Well, in that case, we should take it after the presentation.
Okay.
Okay, so that's where I was getting at. The node, instead of making that once every 10 minutes, they need to make an ongoing effort to be as much as possible in the same state over those 10 minutes. Because if you do that and you get back to like this situation, you don't have those nodes that are, far away. They are all, kind of in the same area, so they have very little work to do for the block. It's also good for user because they can ask those nodes and they're like, okay, all the nodes are in that area of the state space, which means that whatever is going to happen, whatever is going to be true, it's going to be somewhere in that cluster. So I'm going to go quickly against how we can fight this entropy increase to keep it low. Obviously, because of the property of distributed system, you can never keep it to 0. But you can do better than do nothing for 10 minutes and then and then work your ass off to try to reduce it to something close to 0 and then start again. So so there are essentially 2 directions we can go in, right? And the first one would be removing some dimension in which node can go away from each other in that state space, because even though like the slide is 2-dimensional, really the state space is n-dimensional, right? And you can slash some of those dimensions. So one that you can slash is, so if you take about like the information that is in the global state, let's say you are an omniscient being and you would be looking at the network, there is a certain number of transactions that are going in there, even though all nodes may not agree about what this number is and which one are valid or not. So if you do that, you would see that there is a certain amount of state per node, And the larger this state is, the more potential there are for those nodes to grow away from each other. And essentially, you have like 1 bit per transaction of state. That is the node accept that transaction as, you know, being like a good one that's going to be included in like that's going to be confirmed or not, right? So that's 1 bit of information per transaction that is going around. And you have also information about ordering, so each node is going to disagree on what order those transactions have been made. And there is much more information there, right? Because if you have n transactions, there is n factorial possible ordering of those, which means you have n log n bits of information about ordering. And so if you look at it from first principle that way, you realize that within that system, there is like almost all the information is ordering, almost all of it. And so if you pick some number, if you have like 1,000 transactions that are going around, you have like 10 times more information about ordering than about what the transaction is correct or not. If you have millions, it's like 20x. Well, you know to compute log n in base 2. So, this is what it is, right? You get way more information about ordering. So this is one of the reasons. So Peter, you were mentioning that when talking about canonical ordering, you were saying that, okay, you want that for reason X and reason Y and reason Z, and usually that's a bad smell, right? Because that's an indication that you are kind of like trying to fish for reason to do the thing. But I would argue actually X, Y, and Z, like this is the reason. This is the reason. And X, Y, and Z are just consequences of the fact that you reduce the amount of information. So if you reduce the amount of information, it's easier to propagate block around. But as you know, I'm not gonna redo the whole talk, but as you can see, there is like a vast amount of different aspects that are impacted by this. But this is the actual root cause. This is actually what it's like from first principle. This is what it's getting at. So a solution has been proposed. So okay, this first one essentially reduce the dimension in which node can derive from each other. So that's already good, right? Like you de facto have less state to reconciliate if there is less state node can go into to begin with. But you cannot do that for all kinds of state, right? The first n bits, there is no way to do that for them. So there are various solutions that have been proposed over time. And the first one, I think, or at least the first very interesting one that is compatible with Bitcoin and everything was Bitcoin NG. And so Bitcoin NG is a protocol where every time a new block is found, a leader is going to be elected. And so the leader is essentially whoever found the block. And everybody recognizes the leader as the leader, so whatever the leader say is whatever it is, right? So if the leader say this transaction is in, everybody's like, all right, I thought it was not in, but the leader say it's in, so it's in. And vice versa, if the leader say no, everybody's like, okay, okay, no, like maybe I wanted to do it, but the leader doesn't want to, so we're gonna set that with the, going forward, or we don't do it. It works well, except that you kind of rely on the leader until a new block is found. So if you end up having a leader that don't really give a crap about what's going on, or even want to mess with the system, well, the leader has like 10 minutes to mess with the system. Maybe the leader can choose, for instance, to confirm no transaction during the whole time frame of 10 minutes. Say like no to every single transaction. It would be like the leader has no direct incentive, but the leader may have incentive outside of the system to do that. For instance, the leader may short BCH on some exchange and choose to do that. That's always an option. There are always, like, the real world is not as simple as the game theory within Bitcoin. There are many external factors. So another one is weak blocks. So the idea of weak blocks is that we're not gonna produce one big block every 10 minutes, but we're gonna produce what is called weak blocks that have a bit less proof of work than the main blocks, so they can be produced a bit more often. And nodes are gonna essentially agree with what is in the weak block. So instead of reconciliating a big state every 10 minutes, they reconciliate a smaller state every like 1 minute or 2 minutes or whatever is chosen for the time of the weak block. So And I would argue the main problem here is that you are still doing a blockchain with proof of work in that system. And so you still have some time constraints that are not quite where we want them to be. We talked over the past 2 days that really we need to have just a few seconds. Like if it's more than 5 seconds, essentially it doesn't work. And right now we don't quite know how to produce block and propagate them on a 5-second interval. We can do it like maybe in a 10-15 second by pushing stuff, but going below 10 seconds is like a real challenge. So right now we don't quite know how to get to timing that are as low as we would like them to be. But it's a solution that works, that improves significantly over what exists. And so the third idea is to use a protocol such as Avalanche, which is a new class of Byzantine fault-tolerant protocol, where nodes are going to essentially talk with each other and ask each other about whatever the state of the system is several times in a row. And they can do that in such a way and update the entire state based on those responses. And they can do that in such a way that you can prove that they all converge toward the same state, given some property of the system. So I would say it seems like the silver bullet, honestly, but I guess it's fairly new, so it's a bit experimental. Maybe there are some, some consideration about it that have not been quite, thought through yet. This is a paper that is less than a year old, so this is a very recent idea. But I think we should think seriously about it. In my opinion, that's the most promising. Okay, so to get back, to essentially sum up everything in one slide. We need to be fighting entropy on an ongoing basis because it improves fast block preparation, it improves fast feedback on policy, so is your transaction is going to be accepted or not. You can know that right away. It ensures that policy can be emerging from a free market, because if some nodes start applying a different policy, they're going to hash it out with each other, and eventually the network is going to go one way or another. But at least we get away so that we don't need to set that policy. It can emerge, and if enough nodes choose to use a different policy, it's possible, and you get protection against double spend, much stronger protection than we have now. And it can be done in 2 general directions. The first one is reducing the entropy space that you can explore. A good solution there, or at least a solution that slash many dimension of that entropy state, is making a canonical ordering, because all the ordering information is gone. And you can add synchronization mechanism to reconcile the states that that you cannot slash out. And those are going to be mechanisms like NG, Weekblock, or Avalanche.
Yeah, so first of all, great talk. Thank you for that. And I'd just like to make one comment, basically, which is so it seems like the lower limit, it's just an interesting observation, because you say quantum state of superposed uncertainty of transactions. But if you look at it very closely, I think there's actually even a Heisenberg uncertainty bound in the network, which is you take the diameter of the network in terms of speed of propagation, and you multiply it with the transaction rate, and that is the amount of entropy you cannot get below.
Absolutely.
Correct?
Absolutely. You cannot get that entropy to 0. There is no way to do it. But we can get it to value that is much lower than what we have now. And that's the argument I'm trying to make.
Thanks again for the talk. And my question is more specifics around Avalanche. I read the paper. My question is in the fast respend case, if you manage to get around a 50-50 distribution for some reason, Avalanche is indeterministic from how I read the paper, that it actually can't get a result in that case, as the nodes are in an even split. So what kind of notification mechanism are you thinking about in some of those edge cases in Avalanche? I'm just curious your thoughts on it. It's not really an opinion. I just wanted more context on how that works.
So it's a bit different than what you expect. So Avalanche is, if you have a situation where 50-50, you're going to have a lot of flip-flopping, and Avalanche is going to take a long time to converge toward one of the two. But actually, the paper proves that eventually everybody converges in the same direction, because what's happening is that you have random sampling. So even though this is 50-50, depending on the random sample that various nodes are going to do, some of them are going to see something different than 50-50. And because those flippening are going to be random between nodes, eventually they all
But then the
go to that side.
the time it takes for that convergence to occur is well outside the bounds of what we actually need for reliable like zero conf.
Yes.
It can't converge in that case. So are you thinking that there might be a timing where it's like, okay, these nodes are really disagreeing. This kind of proves that there is something malicious happening. There's some kind of double spend because they're not able to do that. So there'd be a timer where it's like, hey, we didn't get a result. This proves that there's a probability of fraud. Is that kind of the thought process?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Okay.
So for most transactions, there is no double spend going on. So for most transactions, you can expect a conversion that is extremely quick in the matter of like 1-2 seconds. But if there is a contention, and if this is very contentious in the network, something close to 50-50 is going to effectively take longer to converge. But in that case, you can, like even as a merchant in face-to-face, you can be like, okay, there is like something weird going on with your payment. It takes a bit longer for my terminal to accept it, But even like what is long for Avalanche is actually quite short for a blockchain, right? So something like 10 seconds is very much in the long tail of what you measure with Avalanche.
The paper shows that even in the 50-50 case, it'll converge in a relatively short number of rounds. And what he just said is that number of rounds is relatively short. But the only time it doesn't converge is if you have people actively flip-flopping their votes, trying to prevent it from converging. Well, even there, it technically will converge if you extend the number of rounds for years or whatever. But we don't want that. So you have like a percentage of malicious users you can tolerate, and above that percentage, it won't converge in a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you have a high percentage of malicious users, they can create a situation where convergence is slower. That means that it's not covered by the Avalanche paper, but that means that if you want to use Avalanche, you need to have some CBIL mechanism, like CBIL protection mechanism. But as it turns out, we are building a system that is all about digital scarcity to begin with. So creating a CBIL mechanism within that is not very difficult. There are actually many options. You can use Coinage, you can use Coin themselves, you can use proof of work, you can probably use kind of stuff, but those seem like the three most obvious ones. So that would mean that someone that wants to create slow convergence by spinning a lot of fake nodes is going to have to put a lot of money on the table to begin with. And if they are a big holder in the system and want to screw with it, they are going to, it's doesn't make a lot of sense, from an economical perspective.
Thanks for a great talk, Amaury. I love the way that you're always looking for simplicity and looking for connections between things. So my question is about you left us hanging because you mentioned Avalanche and the possibilities of it. So the next thing I wanted to know was how will that happen, the querying? Because, and I'm guessing maybe it's not fully developed yet, but.
So I have a fairly good idea. Like I have a proposal that I need to put like in a form where I can propose to people, but I think I have a pretty good idea of how you can do that. The reason I didn't explain that here is mostly time constraint, right? Because I had a lot of framework to put out there, so that so essentially, if I were to come here and explain what I would want to do with Avalanche, everybody would have been very confused because I couldn't like post the framework ID.
So the current system is that a node has the number of peers, 8 or 200 peers. And they already all relay everything to it. So the node is already sort of taking a poll by listening.
Yes.
And if there's a conflict, then it does get one of them first, and that's how it makes a choice. So it seems like you got your work cut out for you beating that because you're going to have to take the time to go start proactively, unless I misunderstand.
Yes, no, that's correct.
You'll have to start asking questions, getting answers, and then it's also talking about multiple rounds. And it does seem like you have a challenge with keeping the performance and speed there to match what we're currently doing.
Yes and no, because for anything that is non-contentious, it converges extremely quickly. So what you need additionally to what we have right now? So we have the inventory message. An inventory message is essentially a vote yes from Saunders node. I accepted whatever that object is, and I'm sending it to you. But then you need another type of message, which is like, I have been told about object X, but I don't think object X should be included. And then you can, and then there is the question, what do you think, right?
So
and
for
you
a
can
double
forward
spend,
this type.
you would start like trying to verify with double spends that other
Yeah,
people.
so say you have transaction A, and then you have transaction B that you receive later on that is a double spend of A. So you're not going to accept that B because by default you use first in as a policy. And what you're going to do is that you're going to query a random sample of the node that you know. And you're going to ask them, OK, I just heard about this B stuff. Do you think B is something we should include in the blockchain? Yes, no. Right? And you're going to ask those nodes. And if they all tell you no, it's going to converge extremely quickly. Or if 90-something% of them tell you no, it's going to converge very quickly. If some say yes, some say no, you're going to need several rounds to.
But don't you already know that your direct peers don't like B? Or they would have sent it to you?
Well, the thing is, you have 8 peers, which with you are, strongly connected, and the other one are like more.
So the sample would be outside of your current peer set? You would.
Yeah. So so the way Avalanche work, and it's very important to, both keep the stuff going fast, but at the same time keep it trustless. It works by choosing randomly sampled quorums to ask the question. So you're gonna pick up like 8 or 10 nodes in all the nodes and ask them the question, but randomly, right? And the important, for the protocol to work, you need to pick a new random quorum every time you need to ask a new question. And because of the property of that randomness, you can prove that essentially when the state of the system as a whole is ambivalent, the probability of that remaining decrease exponentially.
Okay, I'll let someone else go.
Great talk, Amaury. I really enjoyed that. And I think you're totally right that the underlying cause of the problems, instant transactions, block propagation, is all this entropy in the system, which is growing, and we're fighting it. And I really liked the discussion about entropy, because we know that it requires a certain amount of information exchange between the nodes to resolve that entropy. Yeah. So this is a very real mathematically understood effect.
Yeah, this is essentially the floor we cannot go. We know that in practice we're not quite at that level. We change way more information than we need to. But this is like the theoretical floor. We know that we cannot go beyond that.
Definitely, and then we have the Shannon Harvey theorem, which limits how quickly information can be transmitted. So I really like the framework you're building here. You mentioned that CTOR helps us to remove the entropy, and I totally agree. You don't need to transmit the ordering information, but you also, I guess my concern is you also lose information too, because I worry that in the future there will be some value in the natural order that the transactions came in. I know it's not there's not a single objective order, but by going to CTOR, we're just removing that completely. Do you have any concerns that maybe in the future we'll kick ourselves for removing that information?
I don't think so, for a few reasons. So the first one is that if we go back to what the graph of transaction look like, we don't lose that graph, right? That graph is encoded within transaction, right? So what we would not get, for instance, is that we don't know if TX4 or TX5 happened first. This is the information we lose. But we still know that TX3 happened before TX4 and happened before TX5 as well. So we lose that information in the absolute sense, but everything that is relative between different elements in that graph we keep.
Definitely, but I guess like in the case where we went to Weekblocks, we would have finer-grained timestamping.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the case where we went to Weekblocks, we could have finer-grained timestamping, so we might know that TX4 came before TX5. In the future, it requires.
Yeah, but at the same time, you cannot do much with that information. So especially since right now, actually, the transaction in the block are not even ordered in the way the node receives them. It orders like in a crazy complicated way that is based on fee, but also based on how they are connected with each other. So right now, like people need to realize that right now we have no notion of like what people call natural order to begin with. Like the way block templates are constructed completely destroy that already. So this is like we may have the illusion that we have this information today, but we actually don't have it.
We have a quick reply from Holman.
Yeah, so this goes into the same direction. Like, we discussed this before offline, and like I feel like okay, we're going CTOR or LTOR, and there might be like value in going to any order, I guess. With, for example, with like let's say weak blocks turn out to be good, or even there might be a way with.
So going in any order. Actually, like, don't change anything there. Like, if anything, it increases the entropy because there is any order that is accepted. But if you look at the number, it's like completely negligible. Going to any order have some benefits in some other area of the system, I would say, but like really nothing there.
No, I see what you're saying there, but like the improvements you just listed, some of them, as Peter said, like they might add information that might be valuable or not. I mean, the way you describe Avalanche, maybe there can be even like a high resolution timestamping from that or something like that. And so I explained it to you offline. I just want to make this comment again. Like I think it should be, we should actually keep from ossifying into CTOR or LTOR if we could also do any order. And basically just make this, I want to just make this caveat that maybe we want to do like change the order again to something else, and we should be open for that. And I'm just worried a little bit that we ossify there.
So if you do any order, so what we see from this, you know, looking at that from the first principle is that LTOR doesn't really matter. What we need is to have canonical ordering, whatever that canonical ordering is. So right now we do ascending ID for transaction, but we could be descending ID. We could be little Indian, big Indian. We could sort by transaction size, and if they have the same size, we sort by something else. You know, you could like come up with all kind of system to sort the transaction. The important part of it is that the sorting is simple to verify. So transaction ID is very simple. It's a you know, linear process. But beside that, like pretty much any ordering is as good as the other as long as it's canonical. And so, okay, there is something because we are talking about Weekblock. I think it has an interesting impact on Weekblock, actually. So the main problem with Weekblock right now is that it's rather slow because all the Weekblock, they have to build upon each other. And if you reduce the time too much, it's going to become very branchy, and you're going to get a lot of Weekblock that are orphan. And then the uncertainty creeps back in, right? Because you don't know what Weekblock is going to be the one. So if you reduce the time too much, instead of reducing entropy, you end up increasing it. You have like, if you look at the curve, it's similar to the Aston curve if you are familiar with that one. But if you end up having no information about ordering, that means you can deterministically merge to Weekblock, right? And that means that you can change your Weekblock into a DAG. So let's assume we don't have that connection here, right? We have Weekblock 0, Weekblock 1. Or maybe A and B would be better, like they are not ordered anymore. And you can read those two Weekblocks and say you have like Weekblock 0, Weekblock 1, and you can decide, okay, actually the merge state between those two Weekblocks is like somewhere around there, so everybody goes there.
Right. This is actually this is actually some other thing I like to comment on, which is like that is true. However, this is of course not always possible because with a double
That's
span.
not possible in case of double spans.
Right.
So all other sources of entropy lend themselves.
Well, right, but I mean, in the end, like the only entropy that we really have to fight against is a double spend, right? Like if Bitcoin would work perfectly and no one would double spend, we wouldn't need the system. Right?
No, I disagree. There are other sources of entropy that have real impact on user. Like the one where you don't know if a transaction is going to be included or not, and you get to wait hours to figure it out. I think it's a very user impacting problem in the system.
Yeah, okay, but I think like my comment was very general, like just like a very high level perspective. The other thing I wanted to say is like, okay, so you seem to have this problem like when there is a double spend happening in a weak block, then you get this uncertainty, which is like the size of the weak block, like which transaction in the weak block is actually the problem there, right? And so I'm wondering like whether there's like a trade-off, like the size of like the set you create did you want to sync between nodes, and whether like, yeah, does the same happen with Avalanche, or is it like per transaction thing? And it also seems like if you do it per transaction, that it's easier to game the system, and with a block, it's not so easy to game the system. But then it has a disadvantage of like you cannot figure out what is the right one.
No, so there are actually proof that Avalanche is Byzantine fault tolerant and all of that, but the reason why it can converge much faster than system like Weekblocks is because every single node is not going to converge at the same time. So you don't have this synchronicity aspect, right? So when you have a Weekblock, you need to propagate that Weekblock to everybody, and everybody goes to the Weekblock, and everybody synchronize all the state that is in the Weekblock at once. What's happening in Avalanche is that node query each other, and each node have a different subjective knowledge about what the other node are thinking. And you can prove that they're all going to converge to the same state, but actually they are not all going to converge at the same time toward that state. And maybe some of them are going to finalize transaction A very quickly, but not transaction B, and some others are going to do the reverse. Some of them maybe are going to converge for the two very quickly. You cannot guarantee that everybody is going to converge to the same. You can guarantee that they converge to the same state, but not at the same time. And that's the. By making that trade-off, you can ensure that on average this time is much shorter.
So you started in the presentation with some, I think, overly dramatic statements, which I responded to earlier. I think the best thing that I would actually be looking for is some actual information, research, numbers about what kind of entropy we're actually thinking about, because the actual difference in the mempool between different nodes has been shown to be extremely small. We can see that with block relay tests already. The ABC ones were much bigger difference compared to some ABC to some BE ones, but at the same time the ABC nodes had a very predictable way of sending transactions to other nodes, so they were very, very similar. What is the basis of you starting this research? Was there actual need for it, or is this more of a, hey, this sounds like a fun thing to do?
Well, I think we've shown in this conference earlier on that there is actually a problem with zeroconf. We know also like a protocol like Graphene right now has a failure rate of I think like more than 50%. I mean, the failure rate is astronomically high right now.
But if we...
No? 10? I don't know, like Jonathan told me at different numbers.
We're working on other, mempools.
Yeah, so...
Because it's big enough to work on stuff.
Yeah, so even if it's 10%, like 10% is I would argue it's pretty high. Also, even though in practice you see that you have a low different entropy between nodes, you have no way to know about it, so you cannot design around it. Like you cannot assume that entropy is low. You have no.
There's no
information
assumption.
about
but
that.
if you look at the graphene blocks and what kind of transactions needed to be sent between nodes, you have a pretty good idea. This is actual results you can check up on. Also,
yeah, so the result from that we just look, Tom, stop. We just discussed that. We just give you numbers. Andrew Stone here is saying 10%. 10% failure rate is very high.
10% failure rate for the entire block?
For graphene.
For the coding, yeah. So
it's very high. Like it's a factual number. We have also factual number in that slide. Like this is mathematical stuff that you can compute yourself. This is like the lower bound entropy. I mean, you can decide to disregard all of those and pretend that they don't exist, but they do, right? The reality don't care about what you think is real or not.
That's exactly why I'm asking for it.
Okay,
Yeah, so my question is more about, so I am very interested in pre-consensus research. I think this is actually a really interesting topic, so thanks again. My question is really around Sybil attack vectors on full nodes that have just been spun up. and a way to be able to differentiate more trusted full nodes versus ones that could be Sybiled. So in my thought process, and I'm kind of curious your thoughts on this, is if there is a way to prove that the members of the Graphene election were full nodes that were associated with miners that have done proof of work in the past, then you are more Sybil resistant against nodes that have never done proof of work.
Yep.
Is that somewhere that you are exploring a way to be able to basically say, hey, I'm voting for this transaction, and by the way, previously I created this block and I am an actual participating mining member of the network?
Absolutely. So two of the solutions I've been talking about actually do that, right? So Bitcoin NG and Weekblock are linked to proof of work like directly in the way they work. NG select the leader based on proof of work, and Weekblock produce Weekblock with proof of work. So those two are inherently Sybil resistant because of proof of work. Avalanche is not inherently Sybil resistant, so you cannot roll out Avalanche alone. You need to roll out Avalanche and then another extra mechanism for node to know which one are not Sybil resistant. And so, as I was mentioning, you can do that. You can do that in various ways. Essentially, proof of work, proof of stake, or proof of whatever. Though I don't like saying it that way, because this is not what people usually understand with proof of work or proof of stake, because the work or the stake in that case has no bearing in the consensus algorithm whatsoever, right? Like, you don't use work or you don't use stake to come to a consensus. You just use that as a Sybil-resistant mechanism.
Yeah, basically it's a voting filter, so that you know that, like, oh, this vote is more likely to be a reasonable worker.
Like you know that someone, like if someone wants to spin 1 million node, then they're gonna have to put a ton of ASICs on the table, or a ton of coins on the table, or a ton of something. But those ASICs or those coins do not themselves participate to the consensus algorithm. So this is not what people usually understand when they say proof of work consensus or proof of stake consensus.
So basically, if you could basically sign that you, some way to prove a signature that you created a previous block would be a way to guarantee that you had participated in a proof of work round previously.
You need to have a way to tie your node to some scarce resource. Because if it's scarce, like, you know, there is a strong guarantee that you are not a Sybil. And once you can do that, then you can participate to processes like Avalanche.
My thought process is more around how do we prevent it from being kind of a staking mechanism, because I do think that there's some side effects to going to a staking mechanism, and how do we tie that more closely to the proof of work side that we all believe in Bitcoin, and make sure that the Sybil resistance mechanism is actually tied to proof of work in some way.
So you are going there, and this is why I don't like to call that Azure proof of work or proof of stake, because so the problem you get usually with proof of stake is like the rich get richer, and you tend to create an aristocracy in the system. That problem doesn't really exist here, because you don't use your stake as a way to gain consensus. So usual proof of stake algorithm, people are gonna, you know, select some next valid state, and then they're gonna decide on it and sign various stuff. And if they are correct, they're gonna make more money. If they are incorrect, maybe you can slash part of their stake. But none of that is happening here.
We're going to need to draw a line here, but we have one final question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the random sampling of peers in Avalanche. Do Avalanche requires that the random sample of the peers have to be taken from the entire network, or just from the nodes around you that you know about because you are connected to? Because if I guess that Sybil resistant could solve part of the problem, but is the enough to sample around you, even if there is Sybil mechanism, a Sybil-resistant mechanism that.
Yeah. So what you see in practice is that there are a few thousand nodes, but each node knows several hundreds peer on the network, right? So you have very little hops from one point of the network to another. So it's not that big of a deal. Where it's more of a concern is effectively the Sybil attack, but you can mitigate that by tying the node to some scarce resource.
So the random sampling could be taken just to consider one node.
Yeah, you don't need to know every node of the network, but you need to have a big enough sample so that you are not going to be cornered into some stupid position because all the nodes that are connected to you belong to the same guy, right? Or the vast majority of them.